Imagine walking into a casino thinking luck is on your side, but within minutes everything flips. The cards don't lie, the dice don't care, and one risky move can cost you everything or make you a legend. This is the high-stakes world where every second counts. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening for Angela Carter, a respected lawyer who had recently been appointed as a county judge. She had spent the day in her chambers, reviewing case files and preparing for her first official week on the bench. The promotion was a dream come true, the result of years of late nights, endless studying, and countless battles fought in courtrooms across the county. On her way home, Angela decided to make a quick stop at a neighborhood grocery store. She wore a simple navy blue business suit, carried nothing but her purse and a leather folder filled with documents, and looked like any professional woman finishing up a long day of work. She walked through the aisles, picked up a few essentials for dinner, and headed toward the exit. To most people, she was invisible, just another face in the crowd. But to two police officers parked outside, she was something else entirely. As Angela stepped out into the cool evening air and made her way to her car, the patrol car suddenly pulled up, red and blue lights flashing. The officers jumped out with an urgency that caught her completely off guard. One of them stepped forward and barked, "Ma'am, we need to see some ID." Angela froze, clutching her purse tighter. "Is there a reason you're stopping me?" she asked calmly, keeping her voice steady despite the unease growing inside her. The two officers exchanged glances. One smirked while the other spoke. "We got a call about suspicious activity. You match the description of someone who may have been shoplifting inside that store." Angela raised her eyebrows. "That's impossible. I paid for my items. You can check the receipt right here." She reached into her bag, carefully pulling out the small piece of paper that proved her purchase. But the officers didn't bother to look. Instead, their tone grew harsher. "Don't try to get smart with us. You're looking real nervous right now." Angela took a deep breath. She had defended countless clients who went through this very type of intimidation. She knew she had to stay calm, but the situation was spiraling. Within minutes, the accusations escalated. They claimed she had resisted when she simply asked for clarification. They ignored her explanations and treated her with open suspicion, as if her words had no value at all. The next thing she knew, cold metal handcuffs snapped around her wrists. The officers shoved her toward the squad car as bystanders stopped and stared. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, shoppers whispered to one another, and phones began recording. Angela Carter, a newly appointed judge, was being paraded like a criminal across the parking lot. She sat in the back of the car, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to shout out who she was, to scream that they had just arrested the very judge who would soon preside over cases like theirs. But another part of her resisted. She knew that her words would likely fall on deaf ears. In that moment, her title didn't matter. Her skin color had already determined the way these officers saw her. At the station, the humiliation continued. They mocked her calm tone, twisting it into arrogance. One officer leaned against the wall and said, "You people always think you're above the law." Another filled out paperwork, writing false charges, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. Angela could hardly believe what she was hearing. She tried again to show her identification, the one that clearly read Judge Angela Carter. But they brushed it aside like it meant nothing. That night, Angela sat in a holding cell with her phone confiscated, the cold concrete bench pressing against her back. She thought about the irony of it all, how she had spent her career defending justice, only to find herself stripped of her dignity by those sworn to uphold the law. Yet, despite the shame and anger swirling inside her, she refused to let them see her break. Morning came, and so did the fallout. Word spread quickly when Angela failed to appear at her chambers. Colleagues called the station, demanding answers. The police chief, horrified by what had happened, rushed to the precinct and ordered her immediate release. Suddenly, the officers who had been mocking her hours earlier now fumbled over excuses. They called it a misunderstanding, a mistake. Just an overreaction. Angela said nothing. She simply gathered her belongings, lifted her chin, and walked out of the precinct with quiet dignity. She didn't need to argue. She knew the day of reckoning would come, and sooner than they thought. Weeks later, that day arrived. The very same officers walked into a courtroom for their disciplinary hearing. They looked confident at first, whispering to one another, assuming it would be another routine proceeding. But their smug expressions disappeared the moment the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for Judge Angela Carter." The room froze. The officer's eyes widened in disbelief as Angela entered in her black robe, her gavel in hand. She took her seat at the bench, her expression unreadable, her posture commanding. She looked directly at them and spoke with a calm, steady voice. "Officers, I believe we've met before." The weight of her words settled over the room like thunder. The same woman they had dismissed, humiliated, and arrested now held their futures in her hands. And for the first time, they understood what true accountability looked like. Angela had endured humiliation, but she never lost her dignity. Now, in that courtroom, she didn't need to seek revenge. She only needed to do what she had always done: uphold justice, with truth as her strongest weapon. At the station, Angela asked repeatedly for the reason behind her arrest. Each time she tried, the officers brushed her off with smirks. Finally, one of them leaned against the desk and laughed. "You people are always making excuses," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. The words cut deep, but Angela kept her face composed. She had spent her entire career defending people who had suffered at the hands of bias and misconduct. She had heard stories of officers twisting the truth, ignoring rights, and humiliating innocent people. Now she was living the same nightmare. She tried once more, calmly stating, "If you look in my purse, you'll find my driver's license, my bar association card, and my judicial identification. I am Judge Angela Carter." But instead of checking, they ignored her. "Yeah, right," one officer said sarcastically. "Everybody claims there's somebody important. You'll have your chance to explain yourself in court, just like all the others." Angela realized they had no intention of listening. They didn't care about evidence, about her identity, or about the truth. They had already decided who she was in their minds. Not a judge, not even a professional woman, but a suspect they could control. The paperwork came next. She watched as they scribbled down false charges with casual arrogance, resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't fought back, hadn't done a thing besides asking questions. But they needed to justify what they had done, so they invented a story to make her look guilty. Her phone was taken away, her purse locked in a plastic bin, and soon she found herself escorted to a holding cell. The steel door clanged shut behind her, leaving her alone in the dim light. She sat on the hard bench, her wrists sore from the cuffs, her mind replaying the events over and over. It was humiliating. A woman who had spent years fighting for justice was now being treated like a criminal. But Angela refused to break down. She straightened her back and steadied her breathing. She reminded herself that the truth had a way of surfacing. If she panicked, they would win. But if she stayed calm, her dignity would remain intact. Hours dragged by slowly. The cell was cold, and the silence was broken only by the occasional footsteps of an officer walking past. Angela thought about her parents, who had worked so hard to support her education. She thought about her law school professors who had once told her she was destined to change lives. And she thought about the courtroom she was supposed to walk into the next morning to preside over her very first case. Instead, she was locked up, stripped of her freedom by men who didn't even bother to look at her ID. Morning arrived at last. By then, panic had already spread outside the station. Angela's colleagues were frantic. The courthouse staff had been calling her since dawn, confused by her absence. Judges don't simply vanish. When word reached the police chief, He wasted no time rushing to the precinct. The chief stormed in, demanding answers. "Where is Judge Carter?" he barked. The officers looked stunned. "Judge, who?" one asked nervously. The chief's face darkened. "Judge Angela Carter, newly appointed to the county bench. She was due in court today, and I have just learned she spent the night in your custody." Realization dawned on their faces, but it was too late. The chief ordered Angela's immediate release. They scrambled, fumbling with keys, suddenly apologetic. They called it a mistake, a misunderstanding, nothing serious. They acted as if their behavior had been an innocent oversight instead of deliberate misconduct. When the cell door finally opened, Angela walked out calmly. Her clothes were wrinkled, her eyes tired, but her head was held high. The officers who had mocked her now avoided her gaze. One muttered, "Sorry about all this, ma'am." Another tried to smile weakly and added, "Just confusion, you understand?" Angela didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply picked up her belongings, slipped her phone back into her purse, and walked out of the precinct. She knew there was no point in debating with them now. The truth had already revealed itself, and soon the consequences would follow. As she stepped outside into the morning sun, the contrast struck her. Less than 12 hours earlier, she had been handcuffed and shoved into a squad car like a criminal. Now she was free, her reputation intact, and her dignity unbroken. But she also understood something deeper. This wasn't just about her. If a judge could be treated this way, what chance did ordinary citizens have? Angela resolved then and there that she would not let the matter slide. The officers thought they could downplay it as a misunderstanding, but she knew the community deserved accountability. Justice was not about power, it was about fairness, and soon the very officers who had humiliated her would learn that lesson in the one place they couldn't escape, her courtroom. A few weeks later, the same officers found themselves summoned for a disciplinary hearing. Their actions had not gone unnoticed. Angela's arrest had triggered outrage in the legal community, whispers in the press, and pressure from civil rights advocates. The department could no longer brush it aside as a misunderstanding. They had to answer for their conduct. The two officers arrived at the courthouse that morning with stiff suits and forced confidence. They joked with one another in the hallway, trying to mask their nerves. "Don't worry," one muttered. "We'll say we followed protocol. They always buy that." The other nodded. "Yeah, just stick to the story. We'll be fine." They entered the courtroom smirking, expecting another routine proceeding where excuses and half-truths would carry them through. But their confidence evaporated when the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for Judge Angela Carter." The officers froze. Their jaws dropped as Angela strode into the room, her black robe flowing behind her, a gavel in her hand. The woman they had mocked, cuffed, and humiliated now stood at the highest seat in the room, the bench. The audience rose, but the silence was so heavy it was almost suffocating. Angela took her seat with measured grace. She glanced at the officers, her face calm yet unreadable. Then in a steady voice she said, "Officers, I believe we've met before." The color drained from their faces. They shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how fragile their situation was. The smirks were gone. No longer could they rely on arrogance or intimidation. The power dynamic had flipped completely. This wasn't about control anymore. It was about accountability. The proceedings began. The department's internal affairs representative laid out the charges: unlawful arrest, fabrication of evidence, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming of law enforcement officers. Witnesses were called. Store employees testified that Angela had paid for her groceries in full. Bystanders recounted how she had remained calm, asking only why she was being stopped while the officers escalated. Then came the video evidence. Security footage from the grocery store showed Angela walking through the checkout line, paying, and leaving without incident. Footage from a bystander's phone captured the arrest, Angela speaking calmly while the officers manhandled her, accusing her of acting suspicious. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the truth unfolded on the screen. Angela listened quietly, never raising her voice, never interrupting. But when it was her turn to speak, the room stilled once more. "You ignored my identification," she began, her tone sharp but controlled. "You accused me of crimes without cause, and when I exercised my right to ask why I was being detained, you twisted that into resistance. These actions were not mistakes. They were choices, and choices have consequences." The officers tried to defend themselves. One stammered, "We thought she matched a description. We didn't realize—" Angela cut him off, gently but firmly. "Didn't realize what? That I was a judge? That I had a title? Let me remind you, my position is irrelevant. I could have been a teacher, a nurse, a cashier, or simply a woman heading home after a long day. The rights you trampled are the same for every citizen." Her words echoed through the chamber. Even the reporters in the back leaned forward, scribbling furiously. The message was clear. This was not just about Angela. This was about every person who had ever been dismissed, degraded, or wrongfully accused. The officers shifted in their seats, their rehearsed excuses unraveling. They had walked into the courtroom certain they would talk their way out. Instead, they found themselves stripped of control, forced to face the truth under the gaze of the very woman they once tried to silence. When it came time for the verdict, the tension was thick. Angela looked over the courtroom, then back at the officers. "This court finds that your conduct was not only unprofessional but dangerous. You abused your power, falsified charges, and violated the oath you swore to uphold. For that, you will face suspension without pay, mandatory retraining, and placement under supervision. Furthermore, this ruling will remain on your permanent record. Let this serve as a reminder. Authority is not a license for abuse." The gavel struck. The sound rang out like thunder. The officers sat frozen, their faces pale, the reality of their downfall sinking in. Around them, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Members of the public nodded. Some even applauded quietly, knowing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A clear, powerful stand for justice. Angela gathered her papers calmly and rose from the bench. She didn't gloat, didn't smile with satisfaction. Instead, she addressed the room one final time. Justice must apply equally to the citizen and to the officer, to the weak and to the powerful. No one stands above the law. With that, she left the bench, her robe flowing behind her. The officers remained seated, humiliated, and speechless. They had entered the courtroom believing they could manipulate the truth. They left with a permanent reminder that truth had prevailed, and that the woman they once mocked was now the very embodiment of the justice they could not escape. During the hearing, the evidence of misconduct came one piece at a time, and with each piece, the officers' defense weakened. What started as confidence on their faces quickly turned into discomfort, then dread. The first blow came with the grocery store's security footage. The large screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life, showing Angela calmly walking through the checkout line. She placed her items on the counter, waited patiently, paid with her card, and left with her shopping bag and receipt in hand. The timestamp on the footage aligned perfectly with the officer's report of her so-called suspicious behavior. The entire courtroom could see that she had done absolutely nothing wrong. The officers avoided eye contact, their earlier smirks replaced by tightened jaws. One scribbled something nervously on his notepad as if it might save him. The next blow came from the witnesses. A young woman who had been in the parking lot testified. She wasn't resisting. She just kept asking why she was being stopped. Her voice was calm the whole time. The officers seemed angry, almost like they had already decided she was guilty. Another witness, an elderly man, shook his head as he spoke. "I saw the whole thing. That lady did nothing wrong. She even tried showing her ID, but they wouldn't look at it. It was the officers who escalated things." Each testimony painted the same picture. Angela had been calm, respectful, and cooperative, while the officers had been dismissive, aggressive, and biased. Then came the most damning piece, the bystander's phone video. The clip played on the screen, showing Angela standing in the parking lot, her purse still over her shoulder. Her voice was steady. "Officer, I would like to know why I am being detained." She didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't resist. Yet the officers shoved her against the car, snapped handcuffs around her wrists, and declared loudly, "Stop resisting," even though she clearly wasn't resisting at all. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Members of the public exchanged knowing looks, their suspicions confirmed. When the defense attorney asked the officers why they ignored her identification as a judge, their answers fell flat. One officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat and muttered something about protocol. He claimed they couldn't just assume IDs were real without verifying them later. The other officer tried to place the blame on stress, saying the situation was tense and mistakes were made. But their excuses crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The video had shown no tension, only their arrogance. The witnesses had confirmed it. The store cameras had sealed it. There was no mistaking what had happened. Angela, sitting tall in her black robe, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every word she spoke carried weight. Her presence alone commanded the room. "You violated my rights," she said firmly, looking directly at the two men. "But more importantly, you violated the oath you took to protect and serve. That oath is not a suggestion. It is a duty, one that requires fairness, restraint, and integrity. Instead, you allowed bias and arrogance to guide your actions." Angela didn't stop there. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes unwavering. "I want you to remember this day. Remember the witnesses. Remember the cameras. Remember the truth you could not escape. Because this is what accountability looks like. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't humiliate. It simply lays bare the facts and demands that justice be served." The gavel in her hand tapped lightly against the bench, not to signal an end, but to punctuate her message. The room stayed quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. In that silence, the officers finally understood the depth of their failure. And the public watching knew they had just witnessed something bigger than a disciplinary hearing. They had seen the embodiment of justice, calm, strong, and unshakable, delivered by the very woman they had once mocked. For Angela Carter, it wasn't revenge. It was a reminder that the law, when upheld properly, is the greatest equalizer of all. In the end, both officers were found guilty of misconduct. The decision came down with a final crack of the gavel that seemed to echo across the entire courtroom. Their punishment was clear: suspension without pay, mandatory retraining, and placement under strict supervision. It wasn't prison time, but in the world of law enforcement it was a humiliating downfall. The badges they once wore with pride now felt heavy with shame. The verdict left them stunned. These were men who had once strutted with confidence, certain they were untouchable. But now, stripped of their authority and reputation, they looked smaller somehow. Just two men facing the consequences of their choices. For Angela, though, the ruling meant far more than personal vindication. This wasn't about revenge. This was about proving a principle. She had endured humiliation, false charges, and a night in a cold cell. Yet she hadn't fought back with rage or vengeance. She had fought back with truth, with dignity, with the power of justice itself. As the hearing ended and the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed the steps outside. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and questions flew through the air. Angela emerged through the heavy wooden doors, her black robe flowing, her expression calm but resolute. She paused at the top of the steps, scanning the crowd of journalists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had gathered to hear her speak. Then, in a clear, unwavering voice, she addressed them. "No one is above the law, not even those who enforce it," she declared. Her words cut through the noise, silencing the murmurs instantly. Justice must be blind to race, gender, or background. What happened to me is not just my story. It is a reminder that we must hold ourselves to higher standards, especially in positions of power. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing the moment for headlines that would travel far beyond the courthouse steps. By that evening, the story was everywhere. Local stations replayed clips of the hearing. National networks highlighted Angela's powerful words. On social media, her name trended for days. Hashtags like "Justice Served" and "Knock Judge Carter" spread like wildfire. People hailed her as a symbol of strength, dignity, and resilience. Community activists praised her for standing tall against injustice without ever lowering herself to the level of those who wronged her. Civil rights leaders spoke her name alongside other trailblazers who had turned personal pain into a public fight for fairness. For young women, especially those of color, Angela became living proof that resilience could overcome discrimination. Messages poured into her office. Letters from students, mothers, and even strangers who had never met her but felt empowered by her courage. "You are the reason I believe change is possible," one note read. Another said, "Because of you, I will keep chasing my dream of becoming a lawyer." Angela read every letter, her heart heavy but proud. She knew her experience had been painful, but she also knew it had created a ripple far greater than herself. Meanwhile, the officers walked out of the courthouse that day carrying a different kind of weight. Their heads were lowered, their shoulders slumped. No cameras wanted their statements, no reporters asked them for quotes. They were not symbols of justice, they were symbols of failure. For them, it was more than embarrassment. It was transformation. For the first time, they had been forced to see themselves through the eyes of the people they had sworn to protect. They had been stripped of their arrogance and made to stand accountable in the harshest way possible before the very judge they once tried to degrade. Angela returned to her chambers that evening, the echoes of the day still swirling in her mind. She slipped off her robe, folded it neatly, and placed it on the back of her chair. For a long moment, she stood in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. From the flashing lights in that grocery store parking lot to the flashing cameras outside the courthouse. And then she smiled. Not a smile of triumph, but of peace. Justice had been served, not with shouting, not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth. The truth had been enough. Angela sat down at her desk, opened the next case file waiting for her attention, and picked up her pen. Her work was far from over. The fight for justice didn't end with one verdict or one headline. It was a fight that had to be carried out every single day, in every courtroom, for every person who walked through those doors seeking fairness. And Angela Carter was ready. Angela sat down at her desk, opened the next case file waiting for her attention, and picked up her pen. Her work was far from over. The fight for justice didn't end with one verdict or one headline. It was a fight that had to be carried out every single day in every courtroom for every person who walked through those doors seeking fairness. And Angela Carter was ready, because in the end, true justice isn't about revenge. It's about truth, dignity, and accountability. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it and want more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and never miss the next one.